This is the third process in the project scope management knowledge area, define scope. One of the objectives of project planning is to completely define all the work required, so it can easily be understood by the project team. We need this in the project environment, because if we understand what we need to do, we can plan most of the work in advance, and if we don't understand the work that needs to be done, it leads to changes to resources, schedule, and cost. Just assigning a project manager isn't enough to get the scope under control. That's why you need the define scope process. When we are looking at the define scope process, don't forget we are still in the planning process group. Now we're really beginning to get inside the project. When we are defining the scope, we are creating a detailed description of the project boundaries and the acceptance criteria. Remember, not all the collected requirements will be included in the scope. So in this process define scope, you will define which are included and which are excluded. Also remember that in iterative or agile lifecycle projects, we will develop a high-level vision for the overall project, but we will determine the detailed scope at the beginning of each iteration. We will create the detailed planning for the next iteration as we are working on the current project scope and deliverables. So, what are the inputs for defined scope? What do we need? We will need the output from the developed project charter process, which is the project charter. We use it as an input to define scope. If you remember, the project charter provides high-level information about the scope. In this stage of the project, we need to define detailed information about the project scope. So we start with the project charter as our baseline, so we can then define the scope in detail. We'll need to use the project management plan from the previous process, plan scope management. This contains the scope management plan, which tells us how we will define the project scope. We can't go and define the scope before we know how we will define it. Also, in order to define the scope, we need to use the project documents, which are the assumption log, the requirements documentation, and the risk register. The assumption log comes from the developed project charter process. We need it because it contains assumptions and constraints and any other factors that might influence the project or product scope. Those assumptions will help us understand what was being considered when the project was approved. Assumptions are what the management and stakeholders believe to be true about the project. During project initiation, both the assumptions and constraints will be identified and documented on a high level. Now in define scope, we are going to refine and document them in detail. For example, we could make a clear assumption that 5 people will be needed full-time to complete the project. The implicit assumption, which is hidden, is that the people assigned will be available full-time and possess the necessary skills. Of course, if the implicit assumptions are incorrect, serious consequences can occur. The second project document we use is the requirements documentation, which comes from the collect requirements process. The define scope process describes the requirements we've collected. As we said before, we document the requirements in the requirements documentation. We need this document in order to figure out any requirements which should be included. The question is, should we include all the requirements? The answer is no. This is why we need to define the scope to filter the requirements in order to know what should be included or excluded from the scope. And the last project document we need is the risk register, which is an output from the identify risks process. It contains a list of identified risks and a list of potential risk responses. We will talk about it more in the risk management knowledge area. We need the risk register as an input to the define scope process because it contains the response strategies that may affect the project scope, such as reducing or changing project or product scope to avoid or mitigate risk. Typical responses to risk situations include: for threats, our responses are to escalate, avoid, transfer, mitigate, or accept. For opportunities, our responses are to escalate, exploit, enhance, share, or accept. Sometimes you need to make contingency plans in case an event or problem occurs in your project. For instance, you might miss an important milestone, or a vendor you're using might go out of business. When planning for risk, you will plan your responses so that if these situations do occur, your project will stay on track. The responses won't be actioned unless the situations actually take place. So we need to check, does this risk response strategy change or influence any guidance or procedures contained in the project scope? We also want to think about the enterprise environmental factors. We have to consider any factors that can influence the defined scope process. These are anything to do with the external environmental conditions that might affect the success of the project. Finally, we need to consider the organizational process assets, OBAs. We need to check any organizational assets which can also influence the scope. For instance, any policies, procedures, and templates, or any project files from previous projects, and of course, lessons learned from previous phases or projects. What tools and techniques do we need for defined scope? The first one we need for this process and for any other process is expert judgment. Remember, you can't do all the work alone. You always need to ask experts to help you. Then we have data analysis. We use the alternatives analysis method, which we explained before. Here we're using it to evaluate ways to meet the requirements and the objectives identified in the project charter. We also use a decision-making technique, specifically multi-criteria decision analysis, which we also learned about earlier. And we always need interpersonal and team skills, specifically facilitation. This means holding workshops and working sessions with key stakeholders. We also have product analysis. We will use this tool for this process only. Product analysis is used for projects that have a product as a deliverable. It asks questions about the product and creates answers to describe the use, the characteristics, and other relevant information about what's going to be made. An example of product analysis is a product breakdown, which is like creating a WBS, which we will learn about next. You can also create a hierarchical product breakdown structure that details the physical or logical components of a particular product or system under consideration. For example, a house is a product. We can break it down into design, foundation, walls, electrical, and interior. Another example technique is requirements analysis. As we said in the requirements management plan, requirements analysis is examining and breaking down information to further understand it, complete it, and improve it. For instance, what do I need for designing? What do I need to build a wall? And so on. The third technique is systems analysis. This is studying a procedure or a business in order to identify the goals or purposes so we can create systems and procedures that will achieve them in an efficient way. Here we are studying, observing, viewing, or examining the scope. We also have systems engineering. In systems engineering, we focus on analyzing and eliciting customer needs and the functionality they require early in the project lifecycle. Systems engineering originally issued from a need to achieve better project outcomes. It takes into formal consideration the stakeholders' vision. Systems engineering is understanding and correctly identifying what stakeholders wanted to convert the vision into a straightforward functional architecture. Next, there is value analysis. During the course, we will learn about something called Earned Value Analysis (EVA) in detail. Earned Value Analysis is related mainly to cost and schedule management, using various formulas to measure the performance of the project. The best way to think about value analysis is that its focus is to find a less costly way to do the same work. In other words, this technique asks, how can we decrease cost in the project while maintaining the same scope? When performing value analysis, you systematically identify the required project functions, assign value to these functions, and provide functions at the lowest cost without any loss of performance. Remember, just because you are doing a lot more doesn't mean you are getting a lot more done. And the last product analysis technique we have is value engineering. Value engineering and value analysis have the same function with one key difference. Value analysis is concerned with the existing products, but value engineering is concerned with the new products. So this takes place before we invest any capital in tools or equipment. The main output from the defined scope process is a project scope statement. Let's have a closer look at the project scope statement. I've given you a basic explanation about the project charter, that it contains high-level information about the project. Now, in the project scope statement, you are establishing more details about the scope, and you are modifying and adding more details during the project lifecycle, which means that it's progressively elaborated. The project scope statement document is the primary output of the defined scope process. It's a document that provides the basis for making future decisions, such as scope changes. It's used to make sure that all stakeholders have a common knowledge of the project scope. The project scope statement describes the project scope, which includes the project and the product scope, and the major deliverables that are required to be produced to complete a process, phase, or project. Deliverables may be tangible or intangible components completed to meet the project objectives. The third item is the assumptions and constraints, and lastly we have acceptance criteria. If you remember, when I explained the planned scope management process, I said that the plan describes the how, but here after you plan the scope of the project and collected the requirements, this process tells you the what you have to do, what's included in the work, and what's excluded. It says, here's what we will do on the project, or it could say, here's the approved scope for this project. What about the benefits? As we said, the project scope statement provides a common understanding of project scope among project stakeholders. It can also contain clear scope exclusions that can assist you in managing stakeholder expectations. It also enables the project team to perform more detailed planning. It guides the project team's work during execution, and it provides the baseline for evaluating whether requests for changes or additional work are contained within or outside the project scope. This is an example template for the project scope statement. Here we have project scope description. Project scope is progressively elaborated from the project description in the project charter and the requirements in the requirements documentation. We also have the project deliverables and the product acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria can be developed for each component of the project. Lastly, we have to clearly define what's out of scope for the product and the project. Now, let's look at the project documents updates, which is the second output from defined scope. Remember that you always need to update the project documents throughout the project. As a project manager, you can't create a document and forget it or leave it. So you are updating what you have created all the time, except the project charter. This is because the project charter is a one-time creation. No one can update it except the project sponsor. Remember this information for the exam. The documents which we might update are the assumption log, which is an output from the create project charter process. This is because the project scope statement contains assumptions and constraints, so you have to update the assumption log document in case you have something new or changed. We also update the requirements documentation and the requirements traceability matrix. These are documents from the collect requirements process. And finally, we update the stakeholder register from the identify stakeholders process. This contains a list and information about all of the stakeholders. You need to update this document during this process or any process where you meet new stakeholders or you have to update information about any of them.